Good afternoon. Is that working okay, Claire? Can everybody
It
see the
is, yeah.
screen? Fantastic. It's great to be here again. I've spoken to this conference a couple of times, and I think I've got the sort of the now for something completely different slot again, because I'm looking not from the point of view of technology, but from the point of view of people and behaviors. And for the last 5, 6 years, I've taken after 30 years in the sort of water sector, of my focus has shifted from engineering or leadership to actually looking at the behavioral side, and it's been a fascinating journey. I'll be able to give you a bit of a perspective on that today, but really focusing on this core question of how do we move from and what's getting in the way of digital delivery being business as usual from a behaviors perspective. So hopefully I'll give you a perspective on what might be holding us back from that, and also share some tools and concepts to help nudge behavior in the direction that we would like. Because I absolutely believe that all of this digital transformation we're talking about is effectively behavioral change. And so the, the changes in behavior are both needed to drive the digital transformation that we need, but the digital transformation is also changing our behavior. And you just have to think about how we're all operating so differently over the last year, facilitated by digital, as a result of the COVID pandemic. So the two things that for me are absolutely interlinked, and I've summarized digital transformation in this simple slide. So I hope maybe some of you recognize these dynamics where everything we've presented, and I've been watching carefully, the great things that have been presented make absolute sense, and they will absolutely drive up efficiency and performance, and yet maybe often aren't recognized as such. And it's a journey to get us to the adoption that we'd like. So, in exploring behavioral science, it's the interesting question for me is, why do people do the things they do rather than the things that we want them to do? And if we start to think about that in the context of digital delivery, what might be getting in the way of that? So let's start with a little bit of behavioral science. We've talked quite a lot about digital models and digital modeling. Let me give you a very simple model for how we think. And obviously, our brain is a very complex organism, probably the most complex thing in the universe. So to boil it down to two systems is an oversimplification, but it does work pretty well in terms of how we behave. So, two systems of thought proposed sort of by Nobel laureate and sort of godfather of behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman, puts forward. So, system one is our sort of unconscious, automatic, effortless, fast thinking processes. So, when you're asked what's 2 plus 2, the answer immediately comes to you without any effort whatsoever. But system two is where we're being conscious, deliberate, analytical, and when we're thinking about things like 56 times 15, you actually have to use your system 2 processing. So as I say, it's a model, but it actually starts to explain a lot of how we behave and make decisions and choices. And if you want to think about how it feels, the two systems, if you can imagine, do you remember back in the days when we used to commute to work? This now seems a little bit out of date, but if you can imagine this was your regular commute. And you could quite often find yourself on a day with little traffic. You do the whole journey to the office or wherever you were going with almost zero conscious awareness of what's an incredibly incredibly complex process of driving a vehicle. But you can imagine how it feels different when you're in a snowstorm. And anytime I've driven in a snowstorm, I know you're very focused. You turn off the radio. You're completely focused on the task. And that difference between how it feels in system one, that sort of unconscious versus conscious, is really there's two systems in operation. But what we might not like to admit is that system one is really very much in control of our lives, much more than we think it is. And it drives a lot of biases in our behavior. And we can spend a lot of time talking about that. But I'd like to pick out maybe a couple that are relevant to driving change. And if the first one I could pick out is what many of you would have heard about, is loss aversion. So we tend to be losses loom larger than gains. Let me explain this a little bit more. So the brain has not really evolved much since we were on the African savannah about 550,000 years ago. The environment around us has changed massively, but our brains haven't. And so, as we were looking at the necessity to feed our family and seeking prey, to hunt, we were also weighing up the potential risks in that environment, and we're always making that calculation of the potential loss, pain, or disadvantage of a course of action versus the potential gain. And the reason that we're still here as a species is that we were loss averse, and we would tend to be take a dim view of the potential risks and stay more often than not at the status quo. And that loss aversion translates into the environment we find ourselves in now. So if you're trying to push forward a new initiative, a digital change, for example, yes, there might be a promotion, reward, increased salary associated with taking that forward, but there's also a very salient potential risk to people of things going wrong, and how that's perceived has a big impact on us. And this has been calculated using, in behavioral economics. So if you can imagine the positive feeling that you would get if you were to suddenly find £100, and contrast that to the negative feeling that you would get if you suddenly lost £100, and people would generally feel the loss of £100 more than you would feel the positive aspect of gaining £100. And that really creates an interesting dynamic, because in any potential change situation, those with something to lose will fight harder than those with something to gain, which is why in organizations change is so hard. So that leads to the very well known status quo bias. This is a real thing. So the fact that these people are doing the same thing that they've done for quite a long time actually fits very well with that bias that's named after this very famous band. And that status quo bias also relates to how we perceive risk. And risk, it's really important to recognize, it is very subjective. And as we've been thinking about the dynamics of COVID over the last year, the dialogue about how we perceive risk has really come to the fore, because it is so subjective. And so we each perceive risk, and of course we act on our perceived risk rather than the actual risk. So if we're thinking about digital change, you might see that everyone in this conference is already to some extent a convert to digital change, or else you wouldn't be here. The risk to you, maybe the perception of that risk isn't that high, but the project manager or the client, and I was listening to Sean talking about how the client for the Antarctic project really needed to understand that the risk was mitigated. So his perception of that risk was really high, and he had to work really hard to bring down the perception of risk. So that risk perception, risk aversion, loss aversion really gets in the way of change. And we know that if we're dealing with our pets or our children, it tends to not work just to issue instructions to them. I don't know if it works for any of you, but it certainly doesn't work for me. The thing that does work with pets, children, and I think often engineers as well, is how you operate, and the context within which people operate, the consequences that are clear for their behaviors and actions, and the environment in which people operate as well. And that's really at the heart of what I would call engineering behavior change, which is moving away from trying to sell people with information and rational argument and lots of information and memos and instructions, to create an environment where people work things out for themselves. But you can create changes in the environment in which people make the choices, or are more likely to make the choices that you want them to make. So let me share a model with you and try and bring it a bit more closely to some of the challenges of driving digital delivery. So digital delivery powered by STEAM, 5 powerful nudge concepts straight from behavioral economics, and let's see how these could apply in the digital delivery arena. So the first one, make it social. Social pressure and social interaction is so important, and we compare ourselves to our peers. And the reason that I put the Rubik's Cube here is that this is my first recollection of a craze, and I'm sure there's others in the call here that remember when the Rubik's Cube first came out, which was the late 70s, frighteningly enough. And I remember I wanted one because I didn't have one and other people wanted one. So I was following the behavior and I felt an outcast until I got one. So that's what drives crazes. It's that desire to be part of the tribe. And the desire to be part of the tribe is again straight back to our roots from evolution. Because if we were castigated from or expelled from the tribe, that would often mean a very low chance of survival. Whereas now, that fear of people's opinions is still really strong and inbuilt in our nature, and yet the consequences really aren't quite as dramatic. But social comparison is a very powerful weapon in terms of nudging the behavior you might want. So give you an example of this. In the water sector, this company at Viso is using the comparison between the water use of you as a customer of a water company and the average use of people like you. So in this example, the person is actually has a more efficient use of water than other similar people, and that's obviously reinforcing good behavior. And they've used this nudge to drive down, and everybody knows each percentage that you drive down water usage is very significant. So that's a very positive social nudge. And I've stolen Stephen's slide from his presentation earlier, because right in this reporting sort of traffic light slide that Stephen presented about digital delivery in MWH treatment, you have a social nudge, and particularly in the bottom line there, the regional overview, the core tools, the usage, there's 2 regions there that are sort of lagging behind, and that will have a nudging effect to try and see if they can catch up with the people who are ahead. So presenting the right metrics to reflect how people see themselves versus their peers can have a real impact on driving the change you want. If I move to the T in the STEAM model, make it timely. And we are really, really impacted by things that are immediate and certain. And this famous marshmallow experiment, if you Google that, is a fascinating example of the challenge to kids to delay taking one marshmallow immediately with the offer of getting 2 in 15 minutes and how hard they find it. So that immediate gratification is sort of built into us. And let me give an example from my own perspective. Like many of us, you end up in lockdown stocking up on food in the cupboards, and I can last most of the day with my willpower reasonably strong, but towards the end of the day and evening it depletes, and that's when I'm at risk of raiding the cupboard. Now, we did buy one of these things. I don't know if you've ever seen one. It's basically a digital cookie jar that locks the cookies away, or whatever you want, your phone or anything else you don't want to get access to for a period of time. And that's very effective in amending your behavior. And that's effectively a commitment device, which is really something that you put in place in one state of mind to manage your future behavior, knowing that you'll find it difficult in the future. So things like saving each month by direct debit rather than relying on you remembering every month to put some money away in a savings account. Or today I had an appointment with a personal trainer. There's no way I would have just gone to the gym today, but I had that commitment to somebody else. So as you're thinking about digital, if you've got a board presentation on progress of digital on your project, you're much more likely to move things forward. So thinking about how you can create interventions to nudge digital through the life cycle fits with this for me. So if you think about the generic life cycle of a project, there's key moments when you can influence people's behavior end to end. And clearly, the effort to change to digital delivery from a traditional route gets harder the more you go through the project life cycle. So if you can create small but certain consequences, positive ones, early in the process, that's a chance to nudge the changes you want, rather than relying on large uncertain consequences in the future. So we often sell strategies based on jam tomorrow. It'll work because do my thing, adopt this digital technology because it'll save you money at the end of the project. Whereas mentally, you're much more wired to think about the immediate benefits, and those things that may or may not happen way in the future have much less impact on how you might actually behave. So that's the T in time in STEAM. The E is really important. If you want people to do something, make it really easy for them to do it. So let's look at an example of this, something completely different. Organ donor registration. This diagram shows the level of organ donor registration in separate groups of countries. And you can see there's a number of countries that are really high in terms of people signing up to be organ donors, and a number that were very low, including the UK. And the reason is that the system, the default was set up differently. In the countries on the right, the default is that you're opted in. Unless you opt out, you're automatically an organ donor. Whereas the countries on the left, you're only an organ donor if you consciously sign up. Now, the interesting thing was that, and I only found this out recently, was that last year in May, England flipped from an opt-out to an opt-in. So we're now automatically opted in to be organ donors, which you may or may not be aware of, which is clearly going to have a massive, significant impact on the number of organ donors. So if we think about this in a bit more abstract way, we're really talking about the default behavior. So think about in the context of digital delivery, if this is the way we've always done things, we were used to going down the route from A to B, and everybody here with your new great new systems, you've offered what you argue to be a better way of moving from A to C. But A to B is the default. That is how people will behave unless something significantly changes to nudge them to move from A to C down the digital route. Because really, that route feels more like this to them. Anything new, different, will feel hard, complex, challenging, will tend not to do it. So that's why we don't change bank accounts. That's why we tend to stick far too long with insurance providers, etc. So the challenge to us is, how do you flip the default such that the new thing that you want is what's easy to do, and you maybe even make the older thing that you don't want harder to do. So you might make it that the default is you must do a digital rehearsal, and you have to go through an exception process if you don't want to do a digital rehearsal. So flipping the default is a very powerful way of making things easier for people to do. The A in the STEAM model is simply make it attractive. In our over-scheduled, busy world, there's so many things crying out for our attention that we have to work hard to get people's attention. So things that are novel, shocking, interesting, simple, grab our attention, and that means that you're taking the first steps to help people make a change that you might want. And this example clearly is to nudge people to take the stairs by making it attractive by looking like a piano keyboard. And I think that this is a great example of this. I think I'm showing my age here now because I quite like gardening, and the BBC gardening programme, Make Your Garden Perfect, I don't know if anybody's seen it, is a great example of actually the use of digital technology to bring something to life. So it just for me encapsulates how digital technology can be so powerful. And when you watch people put on the virtual reality and goggles and see their environment, their garden transformed digitally first, is a really powerful advert, I think, for digital rehearsal and digital generally. So it sells the end solution. It helps reduce their perceived risk of the change, etc. But it's really attention grabbing, and it's a great example of just making it attractive to people. Um, the final uh, M in Steam is use the right messenger. Um, and over the last year, we've had so much messaging coming seeking to influence our behavior. I just picked out this one recently because the uptake in certain ethnic groups of the vaccination is not where it should be, and so tailoring the messenger, who is asking you to do something. We tend to listen to people who have our respect, who are like us, who are experts with charisma, so that the messenger needs to be carefully picked for whatever you're trying to get across. And it's interesting to maybe think about when that's worked and when that hasn't worked over the last year in the COVID pandemic. But as I think about digital adoption, linking back to the adoption curve, I think Stephen showed a similar curve earlier. The messenger that you might need will be different for different groups of people. So I think by definition, probably people in the room today are at the left-hand side of the curve. But the people at the right-hand side of the curve will want to hear the message from different people, perhaps. So considering who is giving you the message about taking your projects forward with digital delivery, I think it is an important consideration as well. So just to summarize, to pull that together, there's 5 simple things that you can think about to add to what you might be pushing in terms of change management to move digital delivery forward in your organizations. How will you use positive pressure, positive social pressure? What are the key moments of influence? How will you make things easier, which is often what we're not great at. We tend to overcomplicate things. How can you make more attention and make things more attractive? And who is the right messenger for the change you want? So that's a really quick race through a simple model for thinking about behavioral nudging to add to hopefully a lot of what we've talked about already. So that's all I've got, Claire. Happy to take questions.
Cheers. Thank you.